Spink, Captain Tom Spink. Tom has a long military history and a lot of credentials. The interesting part is he has a lot of irons in the fire today. So he is the CEO of the San Francisco Bay Area Squadron of the Association of National Naval Aviation, and he serves on the board of the Moffett Field Historical Society and Museum. That's where I met Tom, and he was very kind to me and my grandson when we toured there. He also is the editor of the Sparrowhawk newsletter, and Tom is offering to share that newsletter with the society. So I think that would be quite interesting. So without further ado, please welcome Tom Spink.
No pressure, Tom. It's the largest audience you've ever spoken to. Oh, did I say that out loud? Well, thank you, Linda, for coming to the museum one day, and I just happened to be there working on the newsletter, and one thing after another, and next thing I know, I find myself here. And then, not only do I run into my neighbors, the Jettas, but I run into Mike Picardo. My first job out of the Navy, I went to work for Singer Link over there on Arquez, where the Fry store is, Fry's Electronics. I mean, they didn't even change the building at all, or the parking lot. Every time I go into that store, I get deja vu, you know, because that's, like I said, that was 1977 to 71. Well, I'll have a little Q&A at the end, and I know everybody wants to know what's going on at Moffett, so we'll save that. But first, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the beginning. And, oops, I guess I got to stay close to there, or at least maybe take it out. So in the beginning, Santa Clara Valley and Sunnyvale and Mountain View in particular looked like this. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Santa Clara looked the same way. A lot of orchards, a beautiful place to live and work. And the thing is after World War I, there were a lot of civics groups that realized that America was no longer isolated by an ocean on either side. And there were countries that had fleets of ships and submarines that could pose a threat to our country by cutting off our sea lanes of communication. And so there was a civics group in the peninsula that raised $500,000 during the Depression. Now, I ought to have a business major friend of mine to figure out what $500,000 is in today's dollars would be worth, but I'm sure it's a lot. And they bought 1,000 acres in the South Bay and sold it to the Navy for $1, with the understanding that the Navy would build a base in which to house observation craft, most in actuality blimps, but I'll talk about that in a second. So in 1931, they started building the base, and it looked like that, and the centerpiece of the base was something called Hangar 1. Unfortunately, that's the way it looks now. And I'll talk more about that later. But and so Hangar 1 was built between 31 and 33, and it was made out of steel. Okay, and it was to house a single airship, and I'll get to that. But basically, you had the hangar. Around here, and this, where is that little pointer thing? This area right here was what we would call VIP circle. And what happened was they're 4,000 square foot houses. They had maids' quarters. They had a back staircase. You know, And the house went with the job. So the admiral, I gotta push the right one here. The admiral lived in this house. His chief of staff was there. The commanding officer of the base was there, and then the wing commander was here. Anyway, so all the heavies had these beautiful houses built in the 30s, and a lot of really nice Christmas parties in the 70s and 80s when I was serving. And as I got a little more senior, we got invited to some of these very, very nice parties. So basically, most of these buildings still exist. Of course, Hangar 1's just a skeleton, and then of course here was the bachelor officers' quarters. This was the admin where the CO of the base lived. The admiral lived in this building. This was the enlisted barracks. This was the base theater. And this still is the commissary. We still do have a commissary, but we lost the Navy Exchange and don't think that's ever coming back. But, so anyway, in April 12th, 1933, they commissioned Naval Air Station Sunnyvale. Now the property line for Mountain View and Sunnyvale runs right down the middle of the property. But all the decisions in those days were made in Washington, and I guess somebody in Washington didn't think that a naval air station should have the word mountain in it. So that's why it became Naval Air Station Sunnyvale. Okay? And Mountain View and Sunnyvale haven't agreed on anything since. But so 8 days before Naval Air Station Sunnyvale was commissioned, Admiral William A. Moffett was in. There were two dirigibles at the time. There was the USS Akron out of Lakehurst, New Jersey. She was going to support the Atlantic Fleet. USS Macon, that I'm going to talk about in a second, she was to support the Pacific Fleet. Okay? Admiral Moffett was out aboard the Akron off the New Jersey coast, got caught in a thunderstorm. Okay, remember that thread? And it crashed with a loss of 20-some lives, including Admiral Moffett. So what they did to honor him was to name the field at Moffett Field, and that name has stuck to this day. So it's Naval Air Station Sunnyvale, but Moffett Field. They called Admiral Moffett the father of naval aviation. He earned a Medal of Honor. He was a ship driver during, I always get this wrong, it wasn't really in World War I, but it was just prior to World War I, and they thought the Germans were going to get a foothold in Mexico. And he drove his destroyer at night into this Mexican harbor with no lights and everything. And then when at first light started shelling the base there. And so I guess for that very, very dangerous maneuver, he earned the Medal of Honor. Little side note, it took us 2 years, but we actually, not too many months ago, got a duplicate copy of his Medal of Honor, and everybody said, oh, you'll never do it. And so we sent our request to a gentleman who was retired as a 2-star admiral, who lived in San Carlos, and he sent it to the gentleman who was his aide back in the 80s, who got all the way up to 4 stars. The man's name was Harry Harris, and he ran the Pacific Fleet not too many years ago, and he now is the ambassador to South Korea. And when that request for a duplicate Medal of Honor hit Washington with a 4 stars endorsement, we got it real quick. So that is Hangar 1 with its skin on, and that is something called the USS Macon. Now the USS Macon was a dirigible. A dirigible is a rigid airship that people can live inside of, okay? It's 800 feet long, and about 275 feet wide, and over 80 people could live and work inside this dirigible. Later on, I'll tell you about blimps. They're just a gas bag with a gondola underneath it, but a dirigible, folks live inside. Again, Akron on the East Coast, Macon on the West Coast. Here she is coming in, either in or out of Hangar 1 by a huge docking mechanism on railroad tracks. Now, you got to remember that this is before radar. We're talking the 1930s. So each of these would go out in front of our fleet looking for any adversaries, visually searching. These little pursuit ships were actually carried inside of the dirigible, okay? And so they would be brought down on a trapeze, released, and could extend that visual search another 100 miles. When they get way out at sea, they take the wheels off and put a gas tank underneath it. So that pilot was coming back to the mothership, or the pilot was going swimming. And the more I've learned from our docents about the maneuver it took to catch that trapeze, the more I was just amazed at the technology and the proficiency that these folks did in the 30s, because the dirigible was running along at about 50 miles an hour, and those little airplanes would come up and practically go into a stall and then have to catch that trapeze. And then the trapeze would bring them up inside the dirigible to refuel, maybe change pilots, and then back out for another mission. And this is so long ago that they didn't have radios. They had Morse code. They had the old teletype, or not teletype, but the thing that you would send Morse code with. So so this is the control room at the front end of the gondola in the front, and then also in there, these were living quarters. Now those beams are something made out of duraluminum, which was invented in the 30s, very strong. Again, I think it was the precursor to aluminum. They called it duraluminum, and we have some examples of that at the museum. But that's a berthing area. There was also a sick bay in case someone got hurt. So again, the Akron crashed off of the New Jersey coast, and so then now the Macon had to cover both coasts, both fleets. So she was coming back from a fleet exercise in the Atlantic, got caught in a thunderstorm over Texas, and what did I do? Anyway, the vertical stabilizer got damaged in that thunderstorm. And so they did some temporary repairs at Moffett Field, and then she left for Southern California to support a fleet exercise down off San Diego. Here's her shadow crossing Market Street. And unfortunately, on February 12th, 1935, she ran into a thunderstorm off of Big Sur. Basically, she kind of settled by the stern, and there were the loss of 2 lives. One person was killed when they jumped too soon from the forward area. This kind of describes it. One person jumped when it was out of the front part, when it was too high, and another person, once it settled into the water, thought they had time enough to go back in and get their logbook, but got sucked down. Years later, a fisherman was fishing off of Big Sur, and he pulled up something looking strange, took it around to various agencies, and finally someone identified it as a piece of the Macon. That National Geographic has gone down and has located the the Macon and the Sparrowhawk pursuit ships inside, and it's been designated a national cemetery, and so you're not allowed to fish around there or dive on it, although I think it's way too deep for diving. So with the demise of both the Akron and the Macon dirigibles, the Navy's adventure into lighter than air dirigibles came to a close, and so they decided to turn Naval Air Station Moffett Field over to the Army Air Corps. Okay, so it became an Army training base in 1935, and so an airplane like that was used as a trainer for Army Air Corps pilots. One of the notables that came through Moffett Field to gain their wings was Jimmy Stewart. And of course, a lot of people remember Jimmy Stewart flew in World War II. He was a bomber pilot, was highly decorated, and actually stayed in the service after World War II and rose to the rank of Brigadier General. I don't have a slide for it. We, not too long ago, found out that Chuck Yeager came through Moffett also. He was enlisted. He was working on airplanes, and then he got an appointment to Officer Candidate School, and the rest is history. December 7th, 1941, we all know that date. So the U.S. was pulled into World War II, and at that point, again, it became obvious that the Navy needed to take the base over and turn it operational again and start flying patrol missions off of our west coast, because they weren't sure if the Japanese could come all the way over here and invade, but they certainly figured that there might be some hit and run things, and there were. There was one case of a submarine shelling I think it was a Chevron or Standard Oil refinery or down in Southern California. And then here's an example of a ship that was actually torpedoed off of Northern California, and they somehow got it over to the coast and beached it before it sank. But those were very isolated, nothing like on the East Coast. The stories I've heard of ships burning off the East Coast practically every night. Again, it was too far for them to send but a couple of submarines now and then. So while the Navy was off getting some blimps built, Goodyear, who was actually building those blimps, lent the Navy Reserve, or the Navy, the Goodyear blimp, because they found out they had a naval reservist who was working for them. And so a naval reservist flying the Goodyear blimp actually flew the first patrols off of the California coast. So on April 16th, 1942, the Army leaves and the Navy takes over. These guys on the left, these are the Army guys. You see how they have very, very glum, really, I'm gonna have to take the timing off of this because I love this. These guys look glum. They're going to the front, all right? Those Navy guys on the right, they've got the smiles on their face. So now, there were blimps at Moffett Field in 3 different sizes, L, M, and K, and the various gondolas were of various size, as well as the bags, and I think the L ship carried about 2 or 3 guys, and but it could only stay out for like a day or two. And the biggest class was called a K ship, and it had a gondola that was 40 feet long, and it could stay out for more than a week. It had about a dozen people on board, and we are in the process now of when they were clearing out Hangar 1, they found the front end and the back end of a K ship that had crashed during the war, and so we've embarked on a very ambitious program with the help of the Smithsonian, has provided some original drawings, And we've given those to some aerospace students at San Jose State, and they've turned it into a CAD-CAM program. And then we've turned that over to an outfit in San Jose that's going to buy some extra steel rods, and then they're going to connect our front section and back section and make this 40-foot gondola, and then we're going to put skin on it and try and populate it with equipment. We have some that we've found, and others, we have some very talented people that can make things that look like that. There are none of these west of the Mississippi. There's 2 in the East Coast and 1 in England, and so we'll have the only K-ship west of the Mississippi. So the last people that tried to do it took 20 years. We're hoping it takes a little less time than that. So during World War II, remember I said Hangar 1 was built out of metal, and it was built between 31 and 33. So during the war, they built Hangar 2 and Hangar 3, and they built them out of wood. And jumping forward to the Q&A, the problem is the most easternmost hangar, Hangar 3, has got a swale in the roof, and they've tried to fix it, and my understanding lately was they don't think they can fix it, so they may have to tear down Hangar 3. But I'll get back to that in the Q&A. A lot of people don't know that during the war, engineers and scientists wanted to get into the action and help win the war on both sides. A lot of our scientists invented, of course, the Brits invented radar, and we improved it. Some of our guys invented sonar and magnetic anomaly detection and sonobuoys that you drop into the water and things like that. Japanese came up with this idea of an incendiary device that would be carried aloft by a balloon, would go up into the stratosphere, come across the Pacific, and then it was on a timer, and then it would drop into our northwestern forests, and their idea was they were going to burn down our northwestern forests. Not very effective. However, one of the things that did happen was the press, one of them landed in Oregon, and the press in that area immediately put out a report and said, this Japanese incendiary device landed in such and such a location on such and such a date. Well, that's intelligence information. So that when the Navy or the Army or somebody found that out, they stopped the press reporting where these things, because then the Japanese could adjust their timing, by that information. So this was top secret, and they actually brought one of these to Moffett Field and disassembled it to learn how it was made and everything. But like I said, it wasn't very effective, but it did start a couple of forest fires, and I understand it did kill one person where it didn't catch fire, and the person was messing with it, and it kind of exploded and killed one person. So there were lots of squadrons of 3 different sizes, and they had engines, and they could fly and be controlled. But when the war ended, and about 1947, the last of the Navy blimps were deflated, and the base basically turned over to transport airplanes. Now, these transport airplanes would take people around the country, and then when the Korean conflict broke out, these were used to take high priority equipment and parts and things like that to the Korean theater and bring wounded back. When the Korean conflict ended, of course, it began with prop planes, and by the time the Korean conflict ended, we were the Air Force, well, it wasn't the Air Force yet, but the Army Air Corps, and it was the Air Force after 47, and the Navy had transitioned to jets. And so the jets came back, and there wasn't enough room up in Alameda for the jets that flew off the aircraft carriers. So a lot of the Navy jet squadrons came down to Moffett Field. Now I'm sure the people in Santa Clara County, weren't all that happy with all that jet noise, but they had to wait till the early 60s to get rid of them. But about that time, NASA, it was called NACA at that time, they took over half of the property and they built some huge wind tunnels. And they also tested practically every kind of airplane you can imagine, some that didn't make it. Okay, so 1958, they changed their name from National Aviation Committee or something like that to Air and Space Administration, or what we call Never a Straight Answer. Oh, wait, I forgot that. Does anybody work for NASA? And this is non-attribute. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. That was a cheap shot. I'm sorry. They are our landlord now, so oh yeah, we love them. So anyway, that was yesterday. Now, like I said, in 1963, the Navy built a base out in the Central Valley called Naval Air Station Lemoore, and that's where the jets went. And I'm sure the people of Santa Clara County and Mountain View and Sunnyvale in particular were not upset. But in came the P-3 Orion, which is the long-range patrol plane, which I flew in. So it's a 4-engine turboprop, long-range patrol plane, about a dozen people in the crew. A lot of missions. You can look for people fishing in the wrong place. You can look for people polluting. You can do search and rescue. You can do a lot of things. But during the Cold War, the main job was looking after the Soviet fleet, both the warships and the submarines. And so a squadron would have 9 airplanes and about 450 people. You would train for a year and then deploy for 6 months to either Japan, Okinawa, or the Philippines. And then you would detach out of there to wherever the action was, wherever the Soviet fleet was moving to. Later on, they started going to a little island in the middle of the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia. I never got that far. I did operate out of Utapao, Thailand, which was a big B-52 base during Vietnam. And I've operated out of Guam and out of Adak, Alaska. But so you basically, you deploy a whole squadron, but then you have 2 planes and maybe 3 crews go to a detachment site to support some operation. This shows Hangar 1 with the skin on. It was where it was the training squadron, and it had a more than 9 airplanes. It had about 22 airplanes in order to accomplish all the training, because it had different models of airplane. Here's some airplanes flying close to the mountains up off Alaska. But in 1994, there was a thing called BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure. Okay, and Moffett was never closed. It was realigned, as Leslie Stahl got wrong on one of her reports on 60 Minutes. But I digress. And so anyway, the active duty Navy left. My reserve outfit stayed till '99, and we still have the Air Guard, and I'll talk about them in a second. But it became Moffett Federal Air Base, which is actually what it's called today. So we got Hangar 1, Hangar 2, Hangar 3, the Air National Guard. This is their hangar, and a lot of their administrative spaces. Our museum is right here by the southwest corner. Okay. And here's our P3 that I was giving tours the last couple of days in, because the bombers are here. Collins Foundation World War II bombers are here, and so we have an old P3A, one of the original analog versions, and we like to have it open on special occasions. So Moffett really has provided protection for the West Coast for almost 80 or over 80 years. First with the dirigibles, then with the blimps, then with the jets, and the coming back from Korea, then the long-range patrol planes. But today, like I said, it's Moffett Federal Airfield, and it's administered by NASA, and but we do have one flying outfit, and it's called the California Air National Guard, the 129th Air Rescue Squadron, and this is a crackerjack outfit, believe me. They've got over 1,000 saves to their credit. One of the most interesting and scary things they do is, let's say a sailor is on a merchant ship a couple hundred miles off the coast and has got an appendicitis, and he needs medical attention right away. Whoops, wrong button. The helicopter has a PJ, a parajumper, a medic on board, but a helicopter doesn't have the range to get that far out, so they actually tank that helicopter 200 miles out over the water using the C-130. If something goes wrong and they can't take on the fuel, they're going swimming. This is right. So they get out over that merchant ship. The helicopter will hover and let that PJ down onto the ship. He'll stabilize the person who's having a problem, lift him up into that helicopter, and back they go to a hospital. I also had a tour of one of the hangars where they've got all their toys. They've got ATVs, they've got little jet skis that have been modified wider so they can go into about 6 inches of water, because their job is to go and rescue somebody, not only just in the water, but up in the mountains, whatever. So really, really an amazing outfit. They just recently took possession of the latest model of C-130. It's called a C-130J. It's got kind of a curved prop, so it's a little bit quieter, glass cockpit, and so that's going to last them for a long, long time. So the Moffett Museum, again, is close to the southwest corner of Hangar 1. We're open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 3. We're kind of proud of the museum because it's got a lot of touchy-feel to it. And we really got a lot of things for youngsters that they can do. We got a lot of uniforms. We've got a lot of china and silver that various senior officers would use that have insignia on it. And so that's the P3 that's out by base operations that I was giving tours, giving tours in. And we also have a P2. We're pulling it into Hangar 3, getting it ready to paint, and all of a sudden things were falling out of the ceiling and they made us get out. So but we've raised enough money to paint both the P2 and the P3, and we're just going to wait for the rainy season to go away and hopefully paint them outside. Have to put tents, probably a tent over one wing and then tent over another wing. One of the first airplanes that that our restoration group worked on was an F-104. A lot of people call it the man and the missile. It's just a huge engine with a single guy in there, and the wings are so thin and so sharp on the front that you have to put a little block of wood across that front leading edge, or if you fell against it, it would actually cut your skin. Very, very fast airplane. They used it to simulate the space shuttle coming down. And NASA gave it to us when they were through with it. And what happened was, it was out by the big wind tunnel. It was all covered with rust. And the people that had been taking care of it retired and moved away. Well, NASA saw some of us out working on the P3 and said, hey, would you guys take care of our airplanes? And we went, sure. So we took it under our wing and we cleaned it up. And it looked like that. And then we made it look like that. And so NASA has a man in space day. They call it Yuri Gagarin Day. He was the first man in space. And so we rolled the 104 over to their celebration. The number 2 guy says, is that my 104? Yes, sir. That was the 104 that was out by the big wind tunnel all covered with rust? Yes, sir. And you did this your own time and your own money? Yes, sir. We've been trying to get our building painted for 2 years, and the painter showed up next week. So you know, like I said, you make friends in strange ways. What can I say? What can I say? We also have a U-2. Now we've all heard about the U-2. It's a spy plane. It's also a high altitude research aircraft. And but it turns out, and they used to have one at Moffett that would take off. I think it was 11 o'clock on a Thursday, and it would be at 35,000 feet by the time it crossed over the Dunbarton Bridge, and by the time it got to San Mateo Bridge, it was above 60,000, which is out of controlled airspace. But anyway, but back in the Cold War, somebody got the bright idea. Let's see if we can fly this thing off of an aircraft carrier, because we're not sure we're always going to have a base from which to operate. And so they put it on an aircraft carrier. They put a tail hook on it. There was only a couple of feet of, it's obviously an angled deck carrier, but they only had a couple of feet off of that right wing. And so off it goes. And it came around and actually landed with that tail hook. And we have one of those airplanes. We've painted it white, but it actually has the tail hook still on it. This was the nose of a Harrier jump jet that NASA had. They were doing some experiments. When we got it, it really was in bad shape. We had to change, put a lot of panels on and paint it up. We actually got a new nose cone from England, because the Brits developed the Harrier. We actually got a nose cone from England, and one problem we had was we let little kids in there, and one little kid was kicking and having a meltdown, and he kicked and kind of destroyed some switches that were very hard to replace. So one of our gentlemen, they made a thing with a red line. You have to be above that red line in order to get in there. But it's a great photo op for adults, children alike. They'll put a helmet on you. Great photo op. But this one gentleman made what I've called the kiddie cockpit, and I don't think I haven't got a picture of that yet. But anyway, he made this thing. It looks like a cockpit. It's got a nice seat and a stick, and it's got all kinds of lights and switches and pedals and all kinds of stuff for people that are shorter than this. And over in the right lower corner, there's a button. And there's a little sign there that says, "Do not push." So you can be just about anywhere in the museum and you hear this really loud ooga horn go off. And the guy that made it is a little bit sick in the head. But we also have models. This was a model, again, remember NASA had a lot of wind tunnels, and this was a model of something that probably never really got built, but was a model. And if you ever go on the base, and by the way, all you have to do is show your driver's license at the main gate. Tell them you're coming to the museum Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 3, and boom, boom, come right up. Well, they've got this model of a space shuttle that they put right after you come in the main gate, and that was a model that they put in their wind tunnel to verify the characteristics of the space shuttle. So we've got an awful lot of pictures. We've got an awful lot of artifacts. That happens to be my plaque. Anyway, this is the P3 section, and this was the plaque when I was commanding officer of the Reserve Squadron. And what the squadrons that flew off of aircraft carriers over at Cuby Point in the Philippines would have 2 of these plaques made, and they would bring one home and put it in their officers club, and then they'd put one in the officers club at Cuby Point O Club. There were hundreds, thousands of these plaques, and so basically what you do is you just have all the names of all the officers and any awards that you had and stuff like that. And so I had it, and I brought it back and put it in the officers club at Moffett. Well, in 1994, when the base shut down, somebody left the back door open, and there were a dozen of these things in the officers club. And somebody called me up and said, "Tom, do you want yours?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" He said, "Well, all of them but yours have been stolen." Mine was on the wall with 4 big lag bolts, and so I got a wrench and I got over there and got it out. And it was in my garage. My wife kept saying, "Get rid of this, get rid of this." I said, Moffett Museum's going to have a place soon. But so here's a picture of Chuck Yeager, picture of Jimmy Stewart, and so a lot of notables came through. This is Jimmy Stewart getting probably a flying cross. Okay, the Distinguished Flying Cross. Like I said, he was very, very well awarded. Let's see. So we're over by the southwest corner. Of course, the museum, the hangar doesn't look like that anymore, but and we also have a small airport next to us, and that's where we have that U-2. We've got an F-18, the early F-18, the F-18A, and that was a Blue Angel. It had something bad that it would do on a real high angle of attack. It would all of a sudden snap to one side, and the Navy didn't like that. And so they gave that to NASA. They put it into the big wind tunnel and figured out an addition, I think, to the leading edge of one of these wings. And so the later model doesn't do that. This is an Army helicopter, Cobra helicopter that we have, and that's just another model that we happen to have. But, we also have, and I think I talked to somebody who was out there, and we have the nose of a P3 that NASA was using to do some flat panel display research. And when they were through, they were just going to let that thing, they were going to put it out in the north end and let it rot away. But we knew about it, and so they gave it to us, and we repopulated it with the old gauges, and so people can actually go in there and see how much instrumentation is in a large patrol plane, and what the kind of knowledge it takes to fly one. Now this is something called the BT-13. That's what Jimmy Stewart learned to fly in. BT for Basic Trainer 13. The story there was we bought this from a guy in LA, and we got it up here only to find out that the pieces were from different airplanes. And our restoration group has done a magnificent job. Some of these guys must have an unbelievable garage or access to a shop, because they've had to make all these parts fit. Plus they've actually had to create a lot of little parts that would go into this corner or that corner. We also had to take all the old paint off because it was a dull paint. We put on the high gloss paint, but that's about 98% done now. And it's none of these are flyable, but for a static display, it is in a beautiful shape. And that's, of course, the F-18.